July 20th, 1969. A boot touches the surface of the moon, and for a fleeting moment in human history, we believed we could conquer the heavens. The Apollo missions weren't just engineering triumphs, they were monuments to ambition, proof that when empires compete, impossible becomes routine. The world watched in awe as astronauts planted flags, collected rocks, and left footprints on a world 240,000 miles from home. It was glorious. It was expensive. And then, silence. The last human to walk on the moon left in December 1972. Apollo 17. The end of an era. What followed was decades of nothing, a cosmic abandonment. NASA shifted its gaze to low Earth orbit, building space stations and launching shuttles while the moon sat forgotten, a dead rock spinning in the void. Politicians lost interest. Budgets dried up. The dream of lunar bases and interplanetary exploration became the realm of science fiction writers and dreamers shouting into the darkness. The moon became a relic, a monument to what humanity could do, but no longer cared to. But empires are built on resources, and someone was still watching. In 1994, a military spacecraft called Clementine, designed to test missile defense sensors, quietly mapped the moon's polar regions. The data suggested something extraordinary: the presence of hydrogen, potentially locked in water ice, hiding in permanently shadowed craters. Then in 2009, NASA deliberately crashed a rocket into the moon's south pole as part of the L-Cross mission. The impact kicked up a plume of debris, and buried within that dust cloud was confirmation: water. Not droplets, not trace amounts, vast reserves of frozen water scattered across the lunar poles like buried treasure. Ask yourself this: why does water on the moon matter? Because water isn't just for drinking. Split it apart, and you get hydrogen and oxygen. Rocket fuel. The moon suddenly transformed from a barren wasteland into the most valuable piece of real estate in the solar system. It's a gas station in the sky, a refueling depot sitting halfway between Earth and the rest of the cosmos. Launch a rocket from Earth, and you're fighting gravity every inch of the way, burning fuel just to escape. But launch from the moon with 1/6 the gravity and fuel harvested on site, and suddenly, Mars, the asteroids, the outer planets, they're all within reach. The architects of power saw the numbers and understood immediately: whoever controls the moon controls the solar system. But there was a problem. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 declared that no nation could claim celestial bodies as sovereign territory. The moon belonged to everyone, which in practical terms meant it belonged to no one. So in 2015, the United States government did what empires do when international law becomes inconvenient. They rewrote the rules. The Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act quietly legalized the extraction and ownership of space resources. Not the moon itself, but everything on the moon. A legal sleight of hand that opened the floodgates. NASA unveiled the Artemis program in 2017, a grand vision to return humans to the moon by the mid-2020s and establish a permanent presence. But this wasn't Apollo. This time, NASA wouldn't build the rockets or the landers. Instead, they would orchestrate, offering contracts, funding, and prestige to private corporations willing to take the risk. SpaceX, Blue Origin, and a constellation of smaller aerospace companies rushed forward, drawn by the promise of government money and the tantalizing possibility of monopolizing lunar resources. Elon Musk's Starship, Jeff Bezos's Blue Moon lander, robotic mining systems from startups you've never heard of, all positioning themselves for the new space race. The moon was no longer a symbol of collective human achievement. It had become a commodity, a strategic asset in the coldest calculation of geopolitical chess. And for the first time in 50 years, the race was back on. But this time, the finish line wasn't just a flag and some rocks. It was an empire, built on ice. There's a moment in every empire when the mask slips, when the noble vision of unity and progress gives way to something far more primal. For decades, space exploration was draped in the language of collaboration, of humanity reaching for the stars together. But billions of dollars have a way of stripping away pretense, revealing the raw desperation beneath. And in the shadow of the moon, that desperation is now tearing alliances apart. April 2021, NASA announces the contract winner for the Lunar Lander program. The prize? A multi-billion-dollar gateway to the moon. The victor? SpaceX. And the loser? Jeff Bezos and his aerospace company, Blue Origin. Now, if you're the richest man on Earth and you've just been humiliated in the one arena where your ego resides, what do? You don't accept defeat. You declare war. Blue Origin didn't just file a protest. They launched a full-scale public relations assault, plastered Washington with attack ads, and weaponized every legal avenue available to tear down SpaceX's victory. The collaborative spirit? Shattered. The facade of innovation for humanity's sake? Gone. This wasn't about advancing civilization anymore. This was about wounded pride, about market dominance, about who gets to plant their flag on the lunar surface and claim the title of architect of the future. Blue Origin's campaign accused SpaceX of receiving unfair advantages, of NASA bending the rules. They painted Elon Musk as a reckless cowboy gambling with taxpayer money. The irony? Bezos himself had spent years lobbying, schmoozing, and throwing his own billions at politicians to secure this very contract. But the billionaire brawl was just the opening act. Behind the scenes, a far more dangerous game was unfolding, one that would rewrite the rules of space itself. For over 50 years, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 had served as the fragile constitution of the cosmos, a UN agreement declaring that space belongs to all of humanity, that no nation can claim sovereignty over celestial bodies. It was idealistic, it was noble, and the United States decided it was inconvenient. Enter the Artemis Accords, a new legal framework crafted in 2020, bypassing the United Nations entirely. The Accords were marketed as a coalition of the willing, a partnership of like-minded nations committed to peaceful exploration. But critics saw it differently. They called it a blueprint for territorial claims, a loophole disguised as diplomacy. Under the Artemis framework, nations could establish safety zones around their lunar operations, zones where others couldn't interfere. Safety zones. That's the language empires use when they want to carve up territory without calling it colonization. Ask yourself this: what happens when those zones overlap? What happens when China or Russia refuse to recognize these safety zones? The moon suddenly starts to look a lot like the South China Sea. And then, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson said the quiet part out loud. In 2021, he warned Congress that if China reaches the lunar South Pole first, they could claim it as their own territory, comparing it directly to the Spratly Islands dispute, a flashpoint where nations have come dangerously close to military confrontation. Nelson's message was clear. This is a race. This is a competition. This is about dominance. The language of cooperation had been replaced with the vocabulary of territorial conquest. The moon was no longer humanity's shared inheritance. It was contested ground. So here we are, billionaires waging legal wars over lunar contracts, nations bypassing international law to stake their claims, and officials openly admitting we're in a new space race, not for science, not for discovery, but for strategic control. The coalition of the willing wasn't about unity, it was about choosing sides. The hubris of Earth had followed us to the heavens, and the moon, once a symbol of human achievement, had become just another battlefield. The question now isn't whether conflict will come, it's when. The moon doesn't care about your dreams. It doesn't care about your budget, your timeline, or the promises you made to a nation hungry for glory. The cold vacuum of space has no mercy for hubris, no sympathy for ambition. And in the early 2020s, the world was about to learn this lesson in the most violent, most expensive way imaginable. Because while politicians gave speeches about a new golden age of lunar exploration, while billionaires sold visions of colonies and mining operations, the moon itself was waiting to devour every ounce of arrogance humanity could muster. Israel was first to fall. April 2019. Bereshit, a privately funded lunar lander carrying the hopes of an entire nation, came screaming toward the surface at thousands of miles per hour. The engine failed. The main computer crashed. And in the final moments, as engineers watched helplessly from mission control, Bereshit slammed into the lunar regolith with the force of a meteor. $200 million vaporized in an instant. National pride scattered across a crater nobody would ever visit. But here's what they told the press. We made it to the moon. Technically true. Bereshit made it to the moon the same way a bullet makes it to a target. The facade of success barely masked the desperation underneath. India followed months later. September 2019, Vikram, part of the Chandrayaan-2 mission, was India's architect of lunar ambition. The descent began perfectly, textbook engineering, flawless execution. And then, 2 kilometers from the surface, telemetry went silent. Contact lost. The lander tumbled out of control, spinning wildly as it plummeted toward the ancient regolith. Search teams found the wreckage days later, a twisted monument to what happens when you cut corners on testing to meet political deadlines. Another $1 billion buried in lunar dust. Another press conference where officials spoke about valuable data and future missions, the language of defeat dressed up as optimism. Japan's turn came in April 2023. The Hakuto R lander, built by the private company iSpace, was supposed to be different. Smarter engineering, better funding, lessons learned from everyone else's failures. The descent looked flawless for 90% of the journey, and then, in the final seconds, a single miscalculation in the altitude software sent Hakuto R accelerating directly into the surface instead of slowing down. The impact created a fresh scar on an ocean of scars. Another graveyard marker. Another corporate press release about critical insights gained. Ask yourself this: how many billions need to be incinerated before we stop calling crashes learning experiences? Russia, desperate to reclaim Soviet-era glory, launched Luna 25 in August 2023. Their first lunar mission in 47 years, a chance to prove they still belonged at the table of spacefaring nations. The lander entered lunar orbit successfully, a miracle considering the state of Russia's space program after decades of corruption and budget cuts. But then came the orbital correction burn. The engine fired too long, just a few seconds too long. Luna 25 spiraled out of control and smashed into the moon at hypersonic velocity. The empire that once conquered the cosmos couldn't even land a refrigerator-sized probe without destroying it. The shadow of former greatness made the failure even more devastating. And then America's commercial program, the crown jewel of NASA's new approach, stumbled out of the gate. January 2024, the Peregrine lander, built by Astrobotic under NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services program, launched atop a Vulcan rocket. Beautiful liftoff, perfect separation, and then, just hours into the mission, disaster. A catastrophic propellant leak, fuel venting into space. The lander was bleeding to death in the void, and there was nothing anyone could do but watch the telemetry flatline. Peregrine never even made it to the moon. It became space junk, incinerated in Earth's atmosphere weeks later. The first mission of America's grand commercial lunar program ended as a fireball over the Pacific Ocean. Billions of dollars, years of development, national prestige, all of it burned away like morning fog. The moon had become exactly what the title promised, a graveyard. Not of explorers, but of ambition itself. Israel, India, Japan, Russia, America, 5 nations, 5 catastrophic failures in 5 years. Billions of dollars atomized, decades of engineering reduced to impact craters and debris fields. And the worst part? Every single one of these missions was supposed to be routine, easy, a stepping stone to something greater. The illusion of an easy return to the moon was shattered, scattered across the regolith like shrapnel. And as the world watched this procession of disasters, one truth became unavoidable. The moon will not be conquered easily. It will demand blood. It will demand treasure, and it will take everything from those arrogant enough to think they've already won. The flags have been planted, the first footprints pressed into lunar dust. But this isn't the romantic exploration you were promised in childhood. This is the quiet rewriting of everything. The moon, once declared the common heritage of all mankind, has been claimed, not by treaties, not by democracy, but by those who arrived first with the capital, the technology, and the audacity to ignore what came before. The Artemis Accords weren't debated in the halls of the United Nations. They were drafted in conference rooms between a handful of nations and their billionaire partners. 13 countries signed initially, then more followed, each one drawn by the promise of resource extraction rights and the fear of being left behind. This wasn't diplomacy, this was orchestration, a legally binding framework that transformed the moon from sacred ground into extractable terrain, bypassing the Outer Space Treaty's idealistic language with surgical precision. Look closely at the language. Safety zones, resource utilization, transparency, and deconfliction. These aren't legal terms, they're corporate euphemisms for territorial claims. A safety zone around your mining operation isn't international cooperation. It's a keep out sign with the backing of national militaries. The architects knew exactly what they were doing. They built a legal facade that appears collaborative while institutionalizing the exact opposite, a framework where first movers become permanent landlords. And then there's helium-3, the isotope that doesn't exist in meaningful quantities on Earth, but saturates the lunar regolith. Conservative estimates place the moon's helium-3 deposits at a value exceeding $10 quadrillion, enough to power fusion reactors for millennia and make whoever controls it the most powerful economic force in human history. This isn't science fiction anymore. Companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX aren't building lunar landers for exploration. They're building industrial infrastructure for extraction. The moon has become the largest unclaimed oil field humanity has ever seen. The race is no longer about landing. It's about staying. Permanent habitats, autonomous mining systems, orbital refueling stations. The first nation or corporation to establish continuous presence doesn't just win bragging rights, they establish precedent. Customary international law favors occupancy and use. Every day they operate, every ton of regolith they process, every structure they build becomes a de facto property claim that future challengers must legally contest. And by the time anyone tries, the infrastructure will be too valuable, too entrenched, too defended to dismantle. Ask yourself this: when has humanity ever discovered a resource worth quadrillions and not fought over it? The moon was supposed to be different. It was supposed to transcend our terrestrial conflicts, our tribalism, our endless hunger for dominance. But we've simply exported the same playbook to a new frontier. The great moon grab isn't a future possibility, it's happening. Now, in real time, governed by legal frameworks most people will never read, and economic forces too powerful to resist. The legacy of this race won't be unity. It will be the cold realization that we carried our worst instincts 240,000 miles into the void and planted them in lifeless soil. The moon is no longer the common heritage of mankind. It's the latest territory in humanity's endless empire building. The race has only just begun, and this time, the prize is a silent world where the rules are being written by those who arrive first, not with the consent of humanity, but with the inevitability of power. August 23rd, 2023. The world watches as India's Chandrayaan-3 descends toward the moon's south pole, a graveyard where Russian ambitions had just been shattered days earlier. The entire nation holds its breath, cameras fixated on mission control screens as the lander approaches the most treacherous terrain in the solar system. This is the moment that will either cement India as a spacefaring superpower or deliver another humiliating failure to add to humanity's growing pile of lunar wreckage. And then, touchdown. Perfect, flawless, $75 million. That's what it cost India to achieve what Russia couldn't accomplish with 10 times the budget, what America had abandoned for half a century, what China spent billions trying to perfect. The Indian Space Research Organization had just pulled off the impossible with a budget smaller than a single Hollywood blockbuster. While the aerospace giants hemorrhaged money into failures and investigations, India had quietly, methodically, brilliantly architected a triumph that made every other space agency look like they were burning cash for sport. The footage streams across the world, a nation of over 1 billion people erupting in celebration, their space program vindicating decades of being dismissed, underestimated, ignored. But while India celebrates, an American company is about to experience every engineer's worst nightmare. February 22nd, 2024. Intuitive Machines' Nova-C lander is hurtling toward the lunar surface, carrying the hopes of America's entire commercial space ambitions on its fragile aluminum frame. This is supposed to be the redemption story, the proof that private enterprise can succeed where government bureaucracy fails. Except, there's a problem. A catastrophic, almost unbelievable problem that nobody discovered until it was too late. The primary navigation system is dead. Not malfunctioning, not degraded, completely disabled. And the reason? A single safety switch that someone forgot to flip before launch. One switch, one human error, one moment of oversight that has now turned a $250 million mission into a potential catastrophe streaking toward the moon at thousands of miles per hour. The lander is essentially flying blind, its eyes sealed shut by a mistake so elementary it would be laughable if it wasn't so terrifying. Mission control erupts into controlled chaos, voices tight with the kind of desperation that comes from watching years of work disintegrate in real time. With minutes until impact, engineers do something that should be impossible. They begin writing a software patch, mid-flight, while the spacecraft is already in its descent sequence. This isn't a simulation. This isn't a test environment. This is production code being frantically compiled and uploaded to a vehicle plummeting toward an alien surface with zero room for error. The backup laser rangefinder, never intended for primary navigation, is hastily reprogrammed to become the lander's only eyes. It's the engineering equivalent of performing open-heart surgery on a sprinting patient. And one wrong line of code means the entire mission becomes another crater, another failure, another mark on America's growing tally of lunar humiliation. The patch uploads. The backup system activates. The lander pitches sideways, its trajectory now unorthodox, ungraceful, borderline suicidal. It's coming in at an angle no mission planner would ever approve, scraping across the lunar surface in what can only be described as a controlled crash. Metal screams against ancient regolith. Systems strain past their design limits. And then, silence. For 17 agonizing seconds, Mission Control hears nothing. No telemetry, no confirmation, just the vast, indifferent emptiness of space swallowing their efforts whole. And then, a signal. Weak, fragmented, but alive. Against every rational probability, against the consequences of human error and impossible odds, Intuitive Machines has just executed the first American commercial lunar landing. Success, failure, the line between them measured in forgotten switches and desperate midnight coding sessions. India celebrates a triumph of meticulous planning and surgical execution. America celebrates surviving its own catastrophic incompetence through sheer, improvised desperation. Both nations now stand on the moon's surface, their landers testament to two radically different philosophies, two opposing visions of how humanity reaches for the stars. One through disciplined precision on a shoestring budget, the other through chaotic innovation fueled by panic and unlimited funding. And as the world processes these twin achievements, one question lingers in the cold vacuum of space. Which approach will define the future?